Ethan Mitchell stood at the edge of his family's farm, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The sight never failed to take his breath away, even after all these years. This land had been in his family for generations, passed down from his great-grandfather to his grandfather, then to his father, and finally to him. But now, as he looked out over the acres of gently swaying wheat and the sturdy old farmhouse in the distance, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything he held dear was under threat. It had all started with a letter from the local homeowners association, or HOA. Ethan had never paid much attention to the group before. After all, his farm was on the outskirts of town, far from the neat rows of suburban houses and manicured lawns. He'd assumed the HOA had no jurisdiction over his property, but the letter had quickly disabused him of that notion. In cold, formal language, it stated that the HOA had deemed his farm abandoned and was therefore claiming it as their own. They gave him 30 days to vacate the premises before they would begin the process of selling off the land. Ethan had been stunned. Abandoned? How could they possibly think that? He'd lived on this farm his entire life, just as his father and grandfather had before him. He poured his heart and soul into working the land, sunrise to sunset. The idea that anyone could look at his thriving fields and well-maintained buildings and see abandonment was absurd. But as he'd soon learn, the HOA's definition of abandoned had little to do with reality. They had their own agenda, and Ethan's farm stood in the way. The first sign of trouble had come long before that letter. About a year ago, a sleek black car had pulled up the long, dusty driveway to the farmhouse. A well-dressed woman had stepped out, introducing herself as Emma Roberts, the new president of the HOA. Ethan had been polite but wary. In his experience, folks from the HOA rarely ventured out to the rural edges of town, and never without a reason. Emma had smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She'd looked around at the farm with a critical gaze, making note of the old truck parked by the barn, the slightly overgrown grass along the fence line, the faded paint on the house. "Mr. Mitchell," she'd said, her tone saccharine, "I must say, your property is quite unique. It's not often we see a working farm in this day and age." Ethan had bristled at the condescension in her voice. "My family has been farming this land for over a century," he'd replied, keeping his tone even. "We take pride in what we do." Emma had nodded, but her expression remained calculating. Of course. It's just that, well, your property doesn't quite fit with the image our community is trying to cultivate. We've been working hard to attract new development, you see. Tidy suburbs, modern amenities. A slice of the countryside like this is a bit anachronistic, don't you think?" Ethan had felt his hackles rise. "With all due respect, ma'am, I don't see how my farm is any business of the HOA's. We're not part of your subdivision." Emma had smiled again, that same chilly smile. "Not yet, perhaps, but this community is growing, Mr. Mitchell. Boundaries can change. I'd hate to see you left behind while everyone else is moving forward." With that vaguely threatening remark, she'd left. At the time, Ethan had dismissed it as an unpleasant but ultimately harmless encounter. He'd never imagined that within a year, the HOA would be trying to seize his family's land out from under him. But here he was, holding a letter that amounted to a declaration of war. The HOA wanted his farm, and they were willing to play dirty to get it. Ethan crumpled the letter in his fist, anger and determination rising in his chest. They had no idea who they were messing with. He was a Mitchell, and Mitchells didn't give up without a fight. He strode back to the farmhouse, his mind already racing with plans. The first step was clear. He needed to get in touch with a lawyer, someone who could help him navigate the legal battle ahead. He'd have to dip into the farm's rainy day fund, but it would be worth it to protect his land and his legacy. As he Reached for the phone. Ethan's eyes fell on the framed photos lining the mantelpiece. Black and white images of his great-grandfather tilling the soil with a horse-drawn plow. His grandfather grinning next to a shiny new tractor. His father, tall and proud, surveying a bumper crop of corn. And in the center, the most recent addition, a picture of Ethan himself, dirty and sunburned but smiling, holding a handful of ripe wheat stalks. This was what he was fighting for, not just land, but a way of life, a connection to the earth and to his own history that ran soul deep. The HOA, with their cookie-cutter houses and artificial turf lawns, could never understand that. But they were about to learn. Ethan Mitchell was a force to be reckoned with when it came to defending what was his. And this farm, this little piece of living history, was his in a way that went beyond mere ownership. He wouldn't let it go without a fight. No matter what the HOA threw at him, no matter how hard they tried to intimidate and cajole him, he would stand his ground. This was one abandoned property that would not be so easily claimed. As Ethan dialed the number for the local law firm, he could feel the spirit of his ancestors at his back, urging him on. The battle was just beginning, but he was ready. The HOA had no idea what they'd started when they tried to take on a Mitchell. Ethan sat in the small, cluttered office of Sophia Davis, the only lawyer in town who had agreed to take on his case against the HOA. She was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a perpetually raised eyebrow that made Ethan feel like he was being cross-examined even during a casual conversation. "So," Sophia said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers, "the HOA is claiming your farm is abandoned and they're trying to seize it under some obscure clause in their bylaws. Is that the gist of it?" Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "They gave me 30 days to vacate, but this farm has been in my family for generations. I live there, I work the land every day. It's the furthest thing from abandoned." Sophia hummed thoughtfully, flipping through the file in front of her. "I've dealt with HOA overreach before, but this is a new one. They usually don't go after properties outside their designated subdivisions." "That's what I thought," Ethan said, "but apparently they've decided my farm doesn't fit with the image they're trying to cultivate." Sophia snorted. "Let me guess. They want to replace it with a shiny new development, something with estates or manor in the name." Ethan couldn't help but chuckle at her dry tone. "Probably." The president of the HOA, Emma Roberts, made it pretty clear that they see my farm as an obstacle to their grand plans. Sophia's eyebrow crept even higher. "Emma Roberts, I know that name. She's been involved in some shady real estate deals in the past, always skirting just on the edge of legality. Never quite enough evidence to nail her, but let's just say her reputation precedes her." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. If Emma had a history of underhanded tactics, maybe they could use that against her. Sophia must have seen the wheels turning in his head because she held up a cautionary hand. "Now, don't get too excited. Proving wrongdoing on her part won't be easy, especially if she's got the rest of the HOA board backing her up. Our best bet is to focus on the abandoned claim. If we can show that your farm is clearly not abandoned, they won't have a leg to stand on." Ethan nodded, his determination renewed. "I've got plenty of evidence of that. Photos, crop yields, maintenance, records. This farm is my life's work." Sophia smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Good, we'll need all of that, but we should also start digging into the HOA's motivations. If we can find out what's really driving this, we might be able to head them off before they make their next move." Ethan left Sophia's office feeling cautiously optimistic. He knew the fight was far from over, but at least now he had an ally and a plan. Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into gathering evidence of his farm's active status. He compiled years' worth of crop sales records, photos of him working the fields, even old family pictures showing the farm's long history. But even as he built his case, strange things started happening around the property. One morning, he found a section of his fence had been cut, leaving a gap big enough for his livestock to wander through. Another day, he discovered that someone had dumped a load of old tires and construction debris in the middle of his wheat field. Ethan reported each incident to the police, but there was little they could do without proof of who was responsible. Ethan had his suspicions. The HOA's tactics seemed to be escalating from bureaucratic to outright sabotage, but he couldn't prove it. The final straw came a week after his meeting with Sophia. Ethan was out in the fields, checking his irrigation system, when he heard a commotion coming from the direction of the farmhouse. He sprinted back, his heart in his throat, to find a group of men in work uniforms surrounding the house, a large truck with a crane parked on the lawn. "What the hell is going on here?" Ethan demanded, storming up to the group. One of the men, a burly guy with a clipboard, stepped forward. "Ethan Mitchell, we're with the county building department. We have an order here to condemn this structure. It's been declared a public safety hazard." Ethan gaped at him.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"A safety hazard? That's ridiculous. This house has stood for over a century. It's in great condition." The man shrugged, handing over a piece of paper. "Take it up with the county. We're just here to do our job." Ethan scanned the document, his disbelief turning to outrage. The condemnation order was filled with vague, unsubstantiated claims about structural instability and code violations. And there, at the bottom, was a very familiar signature. Emma Roberts. Fury coursed through Ethan's veins. This was the HOA's doing, he was sure of it. They were trying to drive him off his land by any means necessary. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed Sophia's number. "They're trying to condemn my house," he said as soon as she picked up, his voice trembling with anger. "They sent a crew out here with some bogus order. Emma Roberts is behind it. I know she is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sophia's voice came through, steely with resolve. "Stay calm, Ethan. Don't let them in the house. I'm on my way." Ethan stood his ground, physically blocking the work crew from entering his home. They argued, waved the condemnation order in his face, threatened to call the police, but Ethan didn't budge. This was his home, and he would defend it. By the time Sophia arrived, the situation had devolved into a tense standoff. She marched up to the crew leader, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "This order is illegal," she snapped, jabbing a finger at the document. "It's a clear abuse of power by the HOA. If you try to enforce it, I'll have you in court. So fast your head will spin." The man blustered and bloviated, but Sophia stood firm. She pulled out her phone and started listing off the various laws and regulations the condemnation order violated, making it very clear that she was prepared to fight this all the way to the top. Finally, the crew backed down. They packed up their equipment and left, grumbling about wasted time and crazy farmers. Ethan sagged with relief, his knees suddenly weak. Sophia turned to him, her expression grim. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "The HOA is pulling out all the stops. Bogus condemnation orders, zoning changes, smear campaigns in the local press. They're painting you as a public nuisance, a blight on the community." Ethan ran a hand over his face, suddenly exhausted. "What do we do now?" Sophia's jaw was set in a determined line. "Now we fight back. We go on the offensive. It's time to dig into Emma Roberts' past and the HOA's real agenda. It's time to expose what's really going on here." Ethan nodded, a slow burn of righteous anger replacing the fear and frustration of the last few weeks. The HOA had picked the wrong fight. They thought they could bully him, scare him off his land, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Ethan Mitchell was a fighter, and he would not back down. Not when his home, his heritage, and his very way of life were on the line. He looked out over his fields, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. This land was a part of him, as much as his own blood and bones, and he would defend it to his last breath. The HOA wanted a war. Well, they were about to get one. Ethan Mitchell was ready to fight, and he played to win. In the days following the confrontation with the county work crew, Ethan and Sophia dove headfirst into their investigation of the HOA and its president, Emma Roberts. They pored over public records, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and reached out to other residents who had tangled with the association in the past. What they uncovered was a disturbing pattern of abuse and overreach stretching back years. Emma Roberts, it seemed, had a history of using her position to bully and intimidate anyone who stood in the way of her agenda. And that agenda, as far as Ethan could tell, was to transform the sleepy rural town into a glitzy suburb, complete with cookie-cutter mansions and strip malls. "She's been buying up properties left and right," Sophia told him one afternoon, slapping a stack of property. "Deeds onto her desk, mostly through shell companies and LLCs, but it's her name on the articles of incorporation. She's assembling land for development." Ethan frowned, flipping through the deeds. "But why come after my farm? I'm not interested in selling, and she must know that by now." Sophia leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her chin. "My guess? Your farm is the linchpin. It's the biggest piece of undeveloped land in the area. If she can get her hands on it, she'll have a huge contiguous chunk of property to work with. The rest of her acquisitions are scattered piecemeal. Your farm would tie it all together." Ethan felt a swell of anger. His family's land reduced to just another piece in Emma Roberts' real estate chess game. "So what? She thinks she can just bully me into selling, make my life miserable until I give in." Sophia's expression was grim. "That's exactly what she thinks. And so far, her tactics have worked. I've talked to half a dozen other property owners who said they sold to her under duress. Constant fines, legal threats, even physical intimidation." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "Well, she picked the wrong target this time. I don't care what she throws at me. I'm not giving up my farm." Sophia smiled, a fierce, predatory grin. "I was hoping you'd say that, because now that we know her game, we can start fighting back." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Sophia launched a counter-offensive. They filed a lawsuit against the HOA, alleging harassment and abuse of power. They went to the local media with their story, exposing Emma's history of strong-arm tactics. They even organized a community meeting, inviting all the residents who had been victimized by the HOA to share their experiences. The meeting was a turning point. As person after person stood up to tell their stories, a picture began to emerge of an organization that had long since abandoned its stated mission of community betterment. Under Emma's leadership, the HOA had become a bully, a tyrant, using its power to enrich a select few at the expense of everyone else. "She told me I had to tear down my kid's treehouse," one woman said, her voice shaking with anger. "Said it violated some obscure rule about unapproved structures. I've had that treehouse for 10 years, and nobody ever had a problem with it before. I got fined $500 for having a non-conforming mailbox," another man chimed in. "It was hand-painted by my wife. She passed away last year, and that mailbox was one of the last things she made. But Emma didn't care. She just saw a way to squeeze more money out of me." As the stories piled up, Ethan could see the mood in the room shifting. The fear and resignation that had hung over the town for so long was giving way to something else. Anger, defiance, a sense of shared purpose. He stood up, his voice ringing out over the murmuring crowd. "This has to stop," he said. "Emma Roberts and her cronies have been using the HOA as their personal piggy bank and enforcement squad for too long. It's time we took our community back." The room erupted in cheers and applause. In that moment, Ethan felt a surge of hope. They were no longer just a collection of isolated victims. They were a movement, united in their determination to stand up to the HOA's tyranny. But Emma Roberts wasn't going down without a fight. As news of the community's resistance spread, she retaliated with everything she had. Ethan woke up one morning to find his driveway blocked by a massive mound of dirt, courtesy of a landscaping project the HOA had undertaken without notifying him. Sophia started getting threatening phone calls, warning her to back off the case. The local newspaper, which had initially been sympathetic to their cause, suddenly published a front-page story painting Ethan as a troublemaker and Emma as a community hero. It was clear that Emma still had allies, people who were profiting from her schemes or who were too afraid to stand up to her. But Ethan and his growing band of supporters wouldn't be cowed. They organized protests outside the HOA's offices, waving signs and chanting slogans. They packed town council meetings, demanding that the elected officials take action against Emma's abuses. They even started a petition to recall the HOA's board and replace it with a new, more representative group. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. More and more residents came forward with their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of the HOA. The lawsuit Sophia had filed started gaining traction in the courts, and a few brave whistleblowers from within the HOA itself started leaking documents that proved Emma's misconduct. The final showdown came at the annual HOA meeting. Emma, sensing that her grip on power was slipping, had called the meeting in a last-ditch effort to shore up support. She stood at the front of the room, a tight smile plastered on her face, and launched into a speech about all the great work the HOA had done under her leadership. But as she spoke, the crowd grew restless. People started shouting questions, demanding answers. Emma tried to shut them down, but the cries only grew louder. Finally, Ethan stood up. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "We all know the truth about what you've been doing, Emma. The intimidation, the fines, the land grabs. You've turned this HOA into your own personal fiefdom, and we're not going to take it anymore." The room erupted. People leapt to their feet, cheering and clapping. Emma's face went white. She tried to regain control, but it was too late. The community had spoken, and they had rejected her. In the end, Emma Roberts was forced to resign from the HOA. The board was dissolved and a new one was elected, made up of residents committed to transparency and fairness. Ethan's lawsuit was settled out of court, with the HOA agreeing to pay damages and relinquish any claim to his farm. It was a stunning victory, one that reverberated far beyond the borders of their small town. Ethan and his allies had shown that ordinary people, when united in a just cause, could stand up to even the most entrenched powers and win. But for Ethan, the real victory was more personal. As he stood on his front porch, looking out over his fields and the house his great-grandfather had built, he felt a sense of peace and belonging that he hadn't known in years. This was his home, his heritage, and he had fought for it. He had defended it against all odds, and in doing so, he had found a strength and purpose he never knew he had. The HOA had tried to take everything from him, but in the end, they had only made him realize just how much he had to fight for, and he knew, with a certainty that ran soul deep, that he would never stop fighting for it. As the sun set over the farm, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and red, Ethan smiled. The battle was over, but the work of building a better community, one rooted in justice and compassion, was just beginning, and he was ready for it. They all were. In the wake of Emma Roberts' resignation and the disbanding of the old HOA board, Ethan and his neighbors found themselves at a crossroads. They had won a major victory, but now they faced the daunting task of rebuilding their community and ensuring that nothing like Emma's reign of terror could ever happen again. The first step was to establish a new HOA, one that would serve the Interests of all residents, not just a powerful few. Ethan, Sophia, and a group of other community leaders spent long hours drafting new bylaws, determined to create a structure that was transparent, accountable, and truly democratic. They held town hall meetings, inviting every resident to come and share their ideas and concerns. They listened as people spoke about the kind of community they wanted to live in, one where neighbors looked out for each other, where diversity was celebrated, and where everyone had a voice. Slowly but surely, a new vision began to take shape. Instead of an HOA that existed to enforce arbitrary rules and collect fines, they would create an organization dedicated to improving the quality of life for all residents. They would focus on things like community events, neighborhood watch programs, and shared spaces where people could come together. One of the first projects they tackled was the creation of a community garden. Ethan donated a portion of his farmland, and dozens of volunteers came out to help till the soil, plant seedlings, and build raised beds. It was hard work, but there was a sense of joy and camaraderie that Ethan had never experienced before. As he watched his neighbors laughing and chatting as they worked side by side, he felt a swell of pride. This was what community was supposed to be about. The garden was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the new HOA launched a whole host of initiatives designed to bring people together. They organized block parties and potluck dinners, movie nights under the stars, and holiday festivals. They started a volunteer program where residents could help out their elderly or disabled neighbors with yard work and home repairs. And through it all, Ethan's farm remained at the heart of the community. He began hosting school field trips, teaching kids about agriculture and the importance of preserving rural traditions. He opened up his land for community events, from 4th of July fireworks to Halloween hayrides. People began to see the farm in a new light, not as an anachronism or an eyesore, but as a vital part of their shared heritage. Ethan's story of standing up to the HOA and fighting for his land became a point of pride for the whole town. It was a reminder that they were stronger together than they ever could be alone. Even Sophia, the tough-as-nails lawyer, found herself drawn into the new spirit of community. She started offering free legal clinics for residents, helping them navigate the complexities of contracts and property disputes. She even joined the garden committee, trading in her power suits for overalls and a sun hat. As the months passed, Ethan could hardly recognize his town. The once sleepy streets were now alive with activity and laughter. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now greeted each other by name. The old divisions between old-timers and newcomers, farmers and suburbanites, seemed to melt away. But perhaps the most profound change was in Ethan himself. The battle with the HOA had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose and responsibility that went beyond just defending his own land. He found himself taking on new roles, as a mentor to young farmers, an advocate for rural issues, a voice for the voiceless. He knew that the fight was far from over. There would always be those who sought to exploit and divide, who saw community as something to be controlled rather than nurtured. But he also knew that he was no longer alone in that fight. He had an entire town behind him now, a tapestry of diverse voices and talents, all working towards a common goal. One evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sun set over his fields, he heard a knock at the door. It was Sophia holding a casserole dish and wearing a mischievous grin. "Thought you could use some company," she said, holding up the dish. "And some of my famous lasagna. I made way too much for just me." Ethan chuckled and waved her inside. As they sat at his kitchen table, trading stories and laughing over glasses of iced tea, he marveled at how much had changed. A year ago, he would have never imagined sharing a meal with the town's most formidable lawyer. Now, she felt like an old friend. "You know," Sophia said, twirling her fork thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about what comes next. For the town, I mean. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still so much work to do." Ethan nodded. "I agree, but I think we're on the right track. We've shown that when we come together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." Sophia smiled. "Exactly. And that's why I think we need to think bigger. We've transformed this community. But what about other towns like ours? Other places where people are struggling against the same kind of injustice and abuse of power?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking about starting a non-profit," Sophia said, "one that could provide resources and support to communities facing HOA overreach or other forms of institutionalized bullying. We could share our story, our strategies, our successes. We could help others fight back and reclaim their rights." Ethan felt a thrill of excitement. It was a daunting prospect, but also an exhilarating one. The idea of taking their local victory and using it to inspire change on a larger scale, it was exactly the kind of ambitious, meaningful work he'd been craving. "I'm in," he said, reaching across the table to shake Sophia's hand. "Let's do it." As the evening stretched on, they talked and planned, their ideas growing more expansive and daring. They imagined conferences and workshops, online resources and media campaigns. They envisioned a network of activists and advocates, all working together to build a fairer, more just society. It was a heady dream, but one that felt within reach. After all, they had already accomplished the impossible once before. They had taken on a corrupt and powerful institution and emerged victorious. They had shown that ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage and commitment, could change the world. As Ethan bid Sophia goodnight and watched her drive away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight with the HOA had started as a battle to save his farm, but it had become so much more than that. It had become a catalyst for transformation, a spark that had ignited a fire of change. He knew there would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, and setbacks to endure, but he also knew that he was ready for them. He had the strength of his convictions, the support of his community, and the knowledge that he was part of something bigger than himself. The HOA had once tried to take everything from him, but in the end, it had given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than he found it. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. As the sun rose over Ethan's farm, casting a golden glow across the fields, he and Sophia were already hard at work. They had spent the past few weeks laying the groundwork for their new non-profit, which they had decided to call Community Defenders. The name seemed fitting, a declaration of their commitment to standing up for the rights and well-being of neighborhoods everywhere. They had rented a small office space in town, just a few blocks from the community garden. It was a humble setting, just a couple of desks, a coffee maker, and a whiteboard covered in ideas and plans. But to Ethan, it felt like the command center for a revolution. He and Sophia had divided up the tasks, each taking on the roles that suited their strengths. Sophia, with her legal expertise and formidable intellect, focused on the structural aspects, drafting mission statements, filing paperwork, reaching out to potential allies in the legal and activist communities. Ethan, with his deep roots in the community and his gift for bringing people together, took on the outreach and organizing work. They started close to home, visiting neighboring towns and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. They spoke at town halls and church basements, in community centers and on front porches. They listened as people poured out their own tales of HOA abuse and dysfunction, offering support and strategies for fighting back. Word began to spread. Local media picked up on their efforts, running stories about the little non-profit that could. Donations started trickling in, small amounts at first, but enough to keep the lights on and the coffee flowing. They even got a few volunteers, retirees, and stay-at-home parents who believed in the cause and wanted to help however they could. But as their work expanded, so did the challenges they faced. Not everyone was thrilled about their mission. There were those who benefited from the status quo, developers and real estate interests, HOA board members and management companies. They saw community defenders as a threat to their bottom line and their grip on power. The pushback started subtly at first. Nasty comments on their social media pages, whispers and rumors spread through the grapevine, but soon it escalated. Their office was vandalized, their tires slashed. Sophia started receiving threatening messages, warning her to back off or face the consequences. Ethan was shaken but not deterred. He knew that they were ruffling feathers, and that meant they were doing something right. If the powers that be were scared of them, it was because they recognized the strength and potential of what they were building. He redoubled his efforts, reaching out to even more communities, building coalitions and alliances. He spoke at a national conference on housing justice, sharing the stage with activists and organizers from across the country. He testified before the state legislature, advocating for stronger protections for homeowners and tenants. And slowly, but surely, they began to see results. A group of residents in a nearby city, emboldened by community defenders' example, successfully recalled their HOA board after years of mismanagement and abuse. A new state law was passed, requiring HOAs to operate with greater transparency and accountability. A national news program did a feature on their work, shining a spotlight on the issue of HOA overreach. Ethan knew that these were just small victories in a much larger fight. For every community they helped, there were dozens, more struggling under the weight of unjust and oppressive systems. But each win, each step forward, fueled his determination to keep going. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and phone calls, Ethan found himself back at his farm, walking through the fields as the sun dipped below the horizon. The work of community defenders had consumed him for months, leaving little time for the simple pleasures of tending to his land. As he ran his hands over the rough stems of his crops, feeling the earth beneath his feet, he felt a sense of grounding. This was why he fought, why he poured his heart and soul into the work, so that communities like his own could thrive, so that people could put down roots and build lives without fear of being uprooted. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sophia, a small smile on her face. "Thought I might find you out." "Here," she said, falling into step beside him. "Big day tomorrow. You ready?" Ethan nodded. They were launching a major campaign, a nationwide effort to educate people about their rights when it came to HOAs and to mobilize communities to take action. It was their most ambitious undertaking yet, and the stakes felt higher than ever. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "We've come too far to back down now, and we're not alone anymore. We've got a movement behind us." Sophia grinned, bumping her shoulder against his. "Damn straight. And we've got each other. Partners in crime, right?" Ethan chuckled. "Partners in justice, more like." As they walked back towards the house, the last light of day fading into a purple dusk, Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, fighting the good fight, standing up for what was right, surrounded by people who shared his passion and his purpose. The HOA had once tried to take his home, his livelihood, his very sense of self. But in their ruthless pursuit of power, they had underestimated the strength of community, the resilience of the human spirit. They had unwittingly set in motion a force for change that would not be stopped. Ethan looked out over his fields, his farm, his little piece of the world that he had fought so hard to protect. It was more than just land, he realized. It was a symbol of something greater, the idea that every person, every family, every Community had the right to live with dignity, with autonomy, with hope. That was the idea that drove him, that fueled the work of community defenders, and it was an idea worth fighting for, no matter the odds, no matter the opposition. As he and Sophia stepped into the warmth of the farmhouse, ready to rest and recharge, for the battles ahead, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The HOA had started this fight, but he and his allies would finish it, one community at a time, one victory at a time, until every neighborhood could stand tall and proud, unafraid and unbroken. The journey was far from over, but one thing was certain: community defenders and the movement they represented were just getting started, and they would not rest until justice was served. As dawn broke over the bustling city, Ethan and Sophia found themselves in the heart of the nation's capital, preparing for the biggest moment of their lives. They had been invited to testify before Congress, to share their story and advocate for sweeping reforms to the laws governing HOAs. It was a surreal experience, walking the marble halls of power, rubbing elbows with senators and representatives. Ethan, who had spent his life with his hands in the soil, felt out of place in his rented suit and shiny shoes. But Sophia, ever the professional, navigated the corridors with ease, her head held high and her eyes sparkling with determination. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, honing their testimony, gathering evidence and anecdotes from the countless communities they had worked with over the past year. They knew that this was their chance to make a real difference, to catalyze change on a scale they had only dreamed of before. As they waited to be called before the committee, Ethan's mind drifted back to the early days of their fight, when it had been just him against the HOA, a David facing down a Goliath. He thought of all the people they had met since then, all the stories they had heard. Stories of abuse and exploitation, of lives turned upside down by the whims of petty tyrants. He thought of the single mother who had been fined thousands of dollars for hanging her children's artwork on her front door, of the elderly couple who had been forced out of their home of 50 years over a minor landscaping dispute, of the disabled veteran who had been harassed and threatened for requesting accommodations for his service dog. These were the people they were fighting for, the voices they were determined to amplify. And as the committee chair called their names, and they rose to take their seats at the witness table, Ethan felt a surge of confidence. They were ready for this. Sophia spoke first, laying out the legal and historical context of HOAs, tracing their evolution from well-intentioned neighborhood associations to sprawling quasi-governmental entities with little oversight or accountability. She spoke of the perverse incentives that drove many HOAs to prioritize revenue generation over the well-being of their residents, of the conflicts of interest that allowed board members and management companies to line their pockets at the expense of homeowners. Ethan followed, putting a human face on the abstract issues Sophia had outlined. He told his own story of the battle to save his farm and the realization that his experience was far from unique. He spoke of the communities they had worked with, of the resilience and courage of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary injustice. As they fielded questions from the committee members, Ethan could see the impact their words were having. Some of the representatives looked shocked, others outraged. A few even had tears in their eyes as they listened to the stories of suffering and hardship. But there was opposition too. Representatives from the HOA industry lobbed softball questions, trying to paint Ethan and Sophia as radicals, as troublemakers out to destroy the American dream of home ownership. They spoke of the importance of property values, of the need for uniformity and order. Ethan could feel his temper rising as he listened to their self-serving platitudes. But he kept his cool, responding with facts and figures, with the indisputable evidence of the harm that unchecked HOA power could inflict on families and communities. As the hearing stretched on, Ethan began to feel a sense of exhaustion creeping over him. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the morning was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. But he pushed through, drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he had. And then, just when he thought he couldn't go on any longer, something extraordinary happened. A man in the audience stood up, his face lined with age and his eyes blazing with intensity. He introduced himself as a retired judge, a man who had spent decades presiding over cases of HOA abuse and overreach. "I've seen it all," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen families torn apart, life savings wiped out, all because of the unchecked power of HOAs. And I've seen brave people like Ethan and Sophia, people who stand up and fight back no matter the cost. They are heroes, plain and simple. And it's high time we started treating them as such." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes. To be recognized, to be validated by someone who had seen the depths of the problem and the heights of the resistance. It meant more than he could put into words. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur, with more testimony, more questions, more debate. But Ethan knew that something had shifted, that a spark had been lit. As he and Sophia left the capital, exhausted but exhilarated, they were mobbed by reporters and well-wishers, all eager to hear more about their mission and their message. And in the days and weeks that followed, that spark began to catch. The footage of their testimony went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. They were flooded with emails and phone calls from people across the country, all with their own stories to share, their own battles to fight. Community defenders became a household name, a rallying cry for a movement that had been building for years. And Ethan and Sophia found themselves at the center of it all, the public faces of a struggle that had once seemed so small and personal. It was overwhelming at times, the weight of so many hopes and dreams resting on their shoulders. But they carried on, buoyed by the knowledge that they were making a difference, that they were giving voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. And as the months passed and the movement grew, Ethan began to see signs of real, tangible change. New laws were proposed, aimed at reining in the worst excesses of HOA power. Class action lawsuits were filed, bringing the fight to the courts and the boardrooms. Communities across the country began to organize, to push back against the tide of greed and ego that had for so long gone unchallenged. It was a long road, and there were setbacks and disappointments along the way, but Ethan knew that they were on the right path, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. And he knew, too, that none of it would have been possible without the love and support of the community that had stood by him from the very beginning. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun set over his beloved farm, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The HOA had tried to take everything from him, his home, his livelihood, his very sense of self. But in the end, they had only made him stronger, more determined, more connected to the world around him. He thought of all the people he had met on this journey, all the stories he had heard. He thought of the judge who had called him a hero, of the countless others who had taken up the fight in their own ways, in their own communities. And he knew that no matter what the future held, he would keep fighting, keep pushing, keep believing in the power of ordinary people to change the world. The HOA had started this battle, but Ethan, Sophia, and the movement they had built, they would finish it, one heart at a time, one home at a time, until justice and fairness reigned supreme. The road ahead was long, but they were ready for it. They were community defenders, after all, and they would not rest until every community, every family, every individual could live with dignity, with security, with hope. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the city skyline, Ethan and Sophia stepped off the plane and into the bustle of a foreign airport. They had been invited to speak at an international conference on housing rights, to share their experiences and insights with activists and advocates from around the world. It was a daunting prospect, to be sure. Ethan, who had never been outside the United States before, felt a flutter of nerves as he navigated the unfamiliar customs and languages. But Sophia, ever the intrepid traveler, seemed to take it all in stride, guiding them through the maze of terminals and taxis with ease. As they settled into their hotel room, jet-lagged but buzzing with anticipation, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. Just a few short years ago, he had been a simple farmer, fighting a lone battle against a corrupt HOA. Now, he was a global advocate, a voice for the voiceless, a champion of justice and equality. The conference itself was a whirlwind of activity, a dizzying array of panels and workshops and keynote speeches. Ethan and Sophia found themselves in high demand, their story resonating with attendees from every corner of the globe. They heard tales of housing struggles in Mumbai and Mexico City, of grassroots resistance in Rio and Johannesburg, of bold new initiatives in Berlin and Barcelona. It was humbling to be part of such a vast and vibrant movement, to realize that their fight was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. But it was inspiring too to see the passion and dedication of so many people, all working towards a common goal of safe, affordable, and dignified housing for all. One moment in particular stood out to Ethan. He was on a panel with a group of activists from a favela in Brazil, listening as they described their years-long battle against eviction and displacement. As they spoke of the violence and intimidation they had faced, of the courage and resilience of their community, Ethan felt a lump forming in his throat. And then, one of the activists turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Your story," she said, "it gives us hope. To know that we are not alone, that there are others out there fighting the same fight, facing the same challenges. It makes us feel less isolated, less powerless. Thank you for that." Ethan was speechless, humbled by the power of her words. He realized in that moment that this was what it was all about. Not just changing laws or policies, but changing hearts and minds, building connections, forging solidarity, creating a global community of resistance and resilience. As the conference drew to a close, Ethan and Sophia found themselves inundated with invitations and requests. Communities from around the world were eager to learn from their experiences, to tap into their expertise and their network. They wanted workshops and trainings, strategic advice and moral support. It was overwhelming, but exhilarating too. Ethan knew that they couldn't possibly answer every call, couldn't be everywhere at once. But he also knew that they had to try, had to do whatever they could to support and amplify the work of housing activists around the globe. And so they set to work, developing new programs and initiatives, leveraging their platform to raise awareness and build alliances. They launched a global network of community defenders chapters, each one a local hub of organizing and advocacy. They created an online resource library filled with toolkits and case studies and best practices from successful housing campaigns around the world. They even started a podcast featuring interviews with activists and experts, exploring the complex and intersectional issues at the heart of the housing crisis. It was a hit, downloaded by thousands of listeners from Nairobi to New York, sparking conversations and collaborations across borders and boundaries. Through it all, Ethan remained grounded in the lessons he had learned back home, in the simple but powerful truths that had guided his fight from the very beginning. The importance of community, of standing together in the face of adversity, the value of persistence, of never giving up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The transformative potential of ordinary people working together for extraordinary change. He thought often of his farm, of the land that had been in his family for generations. He knew that he could never go back to the way things were before, could never be content with the quiet rhythms of planting and harvesting, of sunrises and sunsets. His horizons had expanded, his purpose had grown. He was part of something bigger, Now, something that transcended any one place or person, but he also knew that his roots would always be there, deep in the soil of his home. That the fight he had started, the movement he had helped to build, was ultimately about protecting and preserving the things that mattered most. Family and community, tradition and heritage, the fundamental right to a place to call one's own. As he and Sophia boarded their flight back home, exhausted but energized, Ethan felt a sense of hope and possibility that he had never known before. The road ahead was long and uncertain, the challenges vast and complex. But he knew that they were not alone, that they were part of a global struggle, a collective resistance that spanned continents and cultures. The HOA had once seemed like an insurmountable foe, a Goliath that could never be toppled. But Ethan knew better now. He had seen the power of people, the strength of solidarity, the unstoppable force of a movement united in purpose and principle. They had started small, but they had dreamed big. And now the world was watching, waiting to see what they would do next. Ethan knew that they could not let them down, could not rest on their laurels or retreat to the sidelines. The fight for housing justice was a fight for the soul of our communities, for the very fabric of our society. And it was a fight that they would wage, day after day, year after year, until every person everywhere could live with dignity and security in a place they called home. The HOA had awoken a sleeping giant, and now the giant was awake and ready to roar. As Ethan and Sophia settled back into their work at Community Defenders, after returning from the international conference, they knew they faced a daunting road ahead. The issues they were tackling, systemic injustice, entrenched power structures, the very meaning of home and community, were not ones that would be solved overnight. But they were more determined than ever to keep pushing forward, buoyed by the global solidarity they had witnessed and the deep conviction that change was possible. Their first order of business was to digest and disseminate all they had learned from housing activists around the world. They compiled reports, wrote articles, recorded podcasts, anything to share the wealth of knowledge and inspiration they had gained. They spoke about the innovative community land trusts they had learned about in the UK, which took housing off the speculative market and ensured permanent affordability. They described the powerful tenant unions they had met in Berlin, which were organizing rent strikes and campaigning for the socialization of housing. They highlighted the participatory budgeting processes they had studied in Brazil, which gave favela residents direct control over urban development funds. Ethan found himself especially drawn to the stories of resistance they had heard from communities facing displacement. He couldn't stop thinking about the families he had met from the Kalinganagar slum in India, who had been brutally evicted to make way for a steel plant, or the activists from the Boeung Kak Lake area in Cambodia, who had been fighting for years against a luxury real estate development that had filled in their lake and destroyed their homes. These were people who had lost everything, who had been forced from the places they called home by powerful corporate and government interests. And yet, they refused to give up. They kept organizing, kept resisting, kept demanding their right to stay put and shape their own futures. They were a living testament to the unbreakable human spirit, and Ethan drew strength from their example. He knew that the forces of greed and injustice that these communities were up against were the same ones operating in his own backyard. The details might differ, but the underlying dynamics were the same. The prioritization of profit over people, the erosion of democratic control, the disenfranchisement of the most vulnerable. If Boeung Kak could fight back against a multi-billion-dollar development company backed by the Cambodian government, then surely Ethan's hometown could stand up to the machinations of a petty HOA board. If Kalinganagar could assert the right of slum dwellers to participate in the development process, then surely communities across the US could demand a seat at the table when it came to shaping their own neighborhoods. Sophia, meanwhile, was hard at work translating these global lessons into concrete policy proposals. She was in her element, poring over zoning codes and drafting legislation, meeting with sympathetic officials and hammering out political strategies. She developed a comprehensive federal housing agenda, which included everything from expanded funding for community land trusts and tenant right to council to stronger rent control laws and protections against unjust eviction. She worked with allies in Congress to introduce bills and build support, using the bully pulpit of community defenders to raise awareness and apply pressure. At the same time, she was laying the groundwork for a series of major lawsuits against some of the country's worst offenders in the world of HOA abuse. She was determined to use every tool at her disposal, from the court of law to the court of public opinion, to hold these bad actors accountable and create legal precedents that would rein in their worst excesses. Ethan supported her efforts in every way he could, but his passion remained at the grassroots. He was constantly on the road, visiting communities across the country that were facing HOA challenges. He listened to their stories, offered strategic advice, helped them connect with resources and allies. He also used these trips as an opportunity to organize, to bring people together and help them understand their collective power. He held community meetings in church basements and public parks where residents shared their grievances and began to plot a way forward together. He led direct action trainings, teaching people the tactics of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. Slowly, but surely, a movement was building. In Arizona, a group of retirees living in an HOA-controlled community succeeded in recalling their entire board after Ethan helped them navigate the legal process and rally their neighbors. In Florida, a team of residents facing foreclosure over outrageous HOA fines worked with community defenders to file a class action lawsuit and negotiate a settlement that kept them in their homes. In California, a coalition of tenants' rights groups and anti-gentrification activists, inspired by Ethan and Sophia's example, launched a statewide campaign for a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which would give renters the first shot at buying their buildings when they went up for sale. These were small victories in the grand scheme of things, but each one felt significant. Each one represented a community standing up and asserting its rights, refusing to be bullied or steamrolled. Each one gave Ethan hope that a different way was possible, that the tide was beginning to turn. And yet, he knew they were still in the early stages of a long and difficult fight. For every success story, there were a dozen more communities struggling under the weight of oppressive HOAs or predatory developers. The real estate lobby remained immensely powerful, with deep pockets and armies of lawyers and lobbyists at their disposal. The cultural myths around homeownership and property rights remained deeply entrenched, making it an uphill battle to shift hearts and minds. But Ethan was undaunted. He had seen the power of organized people, the courage of ordinary folks doing extraordinary things. He knew that change was inevitable. The only question was whether they would shape it or be shaped by it. As he sat at his desk one evening, reflecting on all that had happened since those early days, fighting his own HOA, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. Gratitude for all the people who had supported and believed in him, who had taken up the cause as their own. Responsibility to keep pushing, to never settle for half measures or crumbs. He thought back to something one of the Brazilian activists had said at the conference, a quote that had lodged in his mind and never left. "The fight for housing is the fight for democracy." It was a simple statement, but it captured so much. It spoke to the fundamental truth that having a stable, affordable place to call home was essential to being able to participate fully in society. It recognized that the forces that would deny people that right were the same forces that would deny them a voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. Ethan knew that this was the real battle they were engaged in. Not just a fight for housing, but a fight for the soul of their democracy. It was a fight to ensure that communities had the power to determine their own futures, to shape the places where they lived and worked and raised their families. It was a fight he was honored to be a part of, and one he knew he would never stop waging. For his hometown, for communities across the country and around the world, for the generations yet to come. The HOA may have started this fight, but as Ethan and Sophia looked to the future, they knew it would be the people, organized, determined, united, who would finish it, and they would be right there alongside them every step of the way. Ethan and Sophia had barely settled back into their routine at Community Defenders when the next crisis hit. It came in the form of a glossy brochure delivered to every mailbox in their hometown, announcing the arrival of Global Corp, a multinational real estate conglomerate with plans to revitalize the area. At first glance, the proposal seemed innocuous enough. Global Corp was promising to invest millions in the town, building a new shopping center, luxury apartments, and a state-of-the-art office park. They touted the jobs that would be created, the tax revenue that would be generated, the boost to property values that would follow. But Ethan and Sophia knew better than to take these claims at face value. They had seen this playbook before, in countless communities across the country and around the world. A big corporation swoops in with grand promises of prosperity, only to leave a trail of displacement and destruction in its wake. They dug deeper into Global Corp's track record, and what they found was alarming. In city after city, the company had used its vast resources to steamroll over local opposition, often working hand in glove with corrupt politicians and compliant HOAs. They had a history of buying up vast tracts of land, evicting long-time residents, and replacing affordable housing with high-end developments that catered to the wealthy. In one particularly egregious case, Global Corp had collaborated with a local HOA to forcibly remove an entire neighborhood of low-income families, using a combination of legal harassment and outright intimidation. The land had been cleared for a gated community of McMansions, while the displaced residents were left to fend for themselves in an increasingly unaffordable housing market. Ethan and Sophia knew they couldn't let the same thing happen in their hometown. They called an emergency meeting of community defenders and laid out the situation. The room was packed with worried faces, small business owners who feared being priced out, retirees on fixed incomes who were terrified of losing their homes, young families who were already struggling to make ends meet. Together, they began to map out a plan of resistance. They knew they were up against a formidable foe in Global Corp, with its army of lawyers and lobbyists and its bottomless war chest. But they also knew they had something the corporation could never match: the power of a community united. Their first step was to launch an information campaign to counter the glossy PR of Global Corp and reveal the true costs of their proposed development. They went door to door, distributing flyers that laid out the company's troubling history and the likely impacts on the town. They held community forums where residents could share their concerns and strategize together. They worked with local media to get the word out and generate public pressure. At the same time, Sophia was laying the legal groundwork for a challenge to Global Corp's plans. She pored over zoning laws and environmental regulations, looking for any angle to slow down or block the development. She filed Freedom of Information requests to uncover backroom deals and conflicts of interest. She built a coalition of legal aid groups and pro bono attorneys ready to fight the corporation in court. Ethan, meanwhile, was focused on organizing the community itself. He knew that the only way they stood a chance against Global Corp was if they could maintain unity and resolve in the face of immense pressure. He worked to build bridges between different groups in town, the downtown merchants and the suburban homeowners, the environmental activists and the union workers, the old-timers and the newcomers. He organized weekly potlucks where folks could come together and share a meal, swap stories, and build relationships. He convened a people's assembly where residents could democratically debate and decide their vision for the future of the town. He trained a team of block captains, responsible for keeping their neighbors informed and engaged. As the weeks turned into months, the fight against Global Corp began to take a toll. The corporation did not take kindly to the community's resistance. They filed lawsuits against community defenders, accusing them of defamation and interference with business prospects. They spread rumors and misinformation, trying to sow division and discredit the opposition. They even hired private security to intimidate residents and disrupt organizing efforts. But Ethan, Sophia, and their allies would not be cowed. They responded to each attack with renewed determination, drawing strength from the solidarity of their community. When Global Corp tried to buy off local politicians, they organized a voter registration drive and ran their own slate of candidates committed to the public interest. When the corporation tried to silence them with legal bullying, they responded with their own countersuits and media campaigns exposing the company's tactics. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Investigative journalists started digging into Global Corp's practices, uncovering a pattern of abuse and corruption. National housing advocacy groups took notice of the fight and lent their support and resources. Even some investors and shareholders began to question the wisdom of the company's aggressive tactics, worried about the reputational and financial risks. But the real breakthrough came from within the community itself. Inspired by the tireless organizing of community defenders, residents began to take matters into their own hands. A group of small business owners banded together to form a cooperative, pooling their resources to buy up and preserve commercial property. A coalition of faith leaders and community groups came together to create a land trust, with the goal of taking land off the speculative market and ensuring permanent affordability. At a town hall meeting packed beyond capacity, speaker after speaker rose to denounce Global Corp's plans and assert their vision for a different kind of development, one rooted in community control, ecological sustainability, and shared prosperity. In a moment that would go down in local legend, a 92-year-old woman who had lived in the town her entire life took the microphone and, in a voice trembling with emotion, declared, "This is our home. It doesn't belong to any corporation. It belongs to us, to the people who have lived and loved and struggled here for generations, and we're not about to let anyone take it away from us. Not without one hell of a fight." The room erupted in a standing ovation, and in that moment, Ethan knew they had won, not because the battle was over, far from it, but because he could feel the power and determination of his community, united in defense of the place they called home. In the end, Global Corp was forced to back down. Faced with mounting legal challenges, bad press, and an unrelenting grassroots opposition, they announced they were canceling their plans for the town and shifting their investment elsewhere. It was a stunning victory, one that reverberated far beyond the borders of the small town. It sent a message that communities, when organized and empowered, could stand up to even the most powerful corporate interests and emerge triumphant. For Ethan and Sophia, it was a validation of everything they had been fighting for. Proof that another way was possible, that the future belonged to those with the courage to imagine and build it. As they stood hand in hand at the victory celebration, watching their neighbors dance and laugh and cry with joy, they knew that the real work was just beginning. There were so many more communities out there facing the same threats, the same injustices. So many more people yearning for a place to call home, for a voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. But for now, in this moment, they allowed themselves to savor the win, to feel the strength and love of the community they had helped to build. They had taken on a giant and emerged victorious, and they knew with a certainty that filled their hearts to bursting that it was only the beginning. Only the first step in a long journey towards a world where every community could thrive, every person could prosper, every home could be a haven. The fight continued, but so did the hope, the determination, the unshakable belief in the power of people to change their world for the better. Ethan looked out over the sea of faces, the people he had come to know and love as his own, and he knew with every fiber of his being that there was no place he would rather be, no fight he would rather fight. This was his home, this was his community, and he would defend it come what may. The invitation arrived on a crisp September morning, hand-delivered by a courier in a smart Navy uniform. Ethan and Sophia were huddled over their laptops in the Community Defender's office, still riding the high of their victory over Global Corp when the receptionist buzzed them. "There's a letter here for you both," she said, her voice crackling. Over the intercom, from the United States Congress, Ethan and Sophia exchanged a look of surprise and curiosity. They had been so focused on the local fight, they hadn't even considered the national implications of their work. What could Congress possibly want with them? As it turned out, quite a bit. The letter was from the office of Senator Lila Hernandez, a rising star in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. She had been following the story of Community Defenders' battle against Global Corp and was impressed by their tenacity and success. "Your work has caught the attention of many here in Washington," the letter read. "We believe your experiences and insights could be invaluable as we consider legislation to address the growing crisis of housing insecurity and corporate overreach. We invite you to come to D.C. to testify before the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and to meet with lawmakers to share your perspective." Ethan and Sophia were floored. Testifying before Congress? Meeting with senators and representatives? It was beyond anything they had imagined when they first started their little neighborhood group. But as the initial shock wore off, they realized what an incredible opportunity this was. A chance to take their fight to the highest levels of power, to shape national policy and create change on a scale they had never dreamed possible. They knew they had to make the most of it. They spent the next few weeks in a flurry of preparation, honing their message and marshalling their facts. They reached out to their network of allies across the country, gathering stories and data to illustrate the depth and breadth of the housing crisis. They practiced their testimony, anticipating the questions and counterarguments they might face. When the day finally arrived, they were ready. They flew to Washington, marveling at the grandeur of the Capitol Dome as their taxi wove through the city streets. They checked into their hotel, straightened their suits, and took a deep breath. The hearing room was imposing, all dark wood and high ceilings. The senators sat behind a raised dais, a phalanx of aides and staffers behind them. Ethan and Sophia took their seats at the witness table alongside a few other housing advocates and experts. Senator Hernandez gavelled the hearing to order, and then it was their turn. Sophia went first, laying out the legal and policy landscape of housing in America. She spoke about the rise of corporate landlords and the decline of affordable housing stock, the way that archaic zoning laws and tax incentives conspired to drive up costs and drive out residents. She called for a new paradigm, one that put people over profits and communities over corporations. Ethan followed, putting a human face on the cold statistics. He told the story of his own fight against the HOA and of the countless other communities he had worked with who were facing similar struggles. He spoke of the toll that housing insecurity takes on families and neighborhoods, the way it robs people of their dignity and their hope. He challenged the senators to imagine a different future, one where every person has a safe, stable, affordable place to call home. One where communities have the power to shape their own destinies, free from the tyranny of greed and exploitation. As they spoke, Ethan could feel the energy in the room shifting. He could see the senators leaning forward in their seats, scribbling notes and whispering to their aides. He could hear the murmurs of agreement and approval from the audience behind him. And then, in a moment he would never forget, Senator Hernandez looked up from her notes and fixed Ethan with a steely gaze. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "what you and Ms. Davis have accomplished is nothing short of remarkable. You have shown us that organized communities can take on even the most powerful corporate interests and win. But I have to ask, what comes next? How do we take the lessons you've learned and apply them on a national scale? How do we build a movement that can truly transform housing in America?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This was the question he had been grappling with for months, the one that kept him up at night. "Senator," he began, "I believe we need a multi-pronged approach. We need to empower communities with the tools and resources they need to fight back against predatory development and assert their rights. We need to reform our laws and policies to prioritize housing as a human right, not a commodity. And we need to build a broad-based movement, one that brings together tenants and homeowners, urban and rural, young and old, to demand change." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces in the room. "But most of all," he continued, "we need to fundamentally change the way we think about housing. For too long, we've treated it as just another market to be exploited, another asset to be maximized. But a home is so much more than that. It's the foundation of our lives, our families, our communities. It's a basic necessity, as essential as food or healthcare or education. When we start to see housing in that light, as a public good, a shared responsibility, a cornerstone of our social contract, then I believe we can begin to make real progress. Then we can start to build a society where everyone has a place to call home and no one is left behind." As Ethan finished, the room erupted in applause. Senator Hernandez gavelled for order, but he could see the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your testimony and for your tireless work. I promise you, we will not let it be in vain." The rest of the hearing passed in a blur as senators peppered them with questions and praise. Afterwards, they were whisked from meeting to meeting, shaking hands with lawmakers and policy experts, sharing their stories and their vision for change. It was exhilarating and exhausting. By the end of the day, Ethan felt like he had run a marathon, his brain buzzing with new ideas and possibilities. But beneath the fatigue, there was a deep sense of purpose, of conviction. They had planted a seed here in Washington, one that had the potential to grow into something truly transformative. And as they boarded their flight back home, Ethan knew that their work was just beginning. The fight for housing justice was a long one, and there would be many more battles ahead. But armed with the knowledge and the network they had gained, the solidarity and the strength of their community behind them, Ethan and Sophia were ready to keep pushing forward. They had seen firsthand the power of organized people to change the world, and they knew with every fiber of their being that a better future was possible, if only they had the courage to fight for it. As the plane lifted off into the night sky, Ethan looked out the window at the city lights below. He thought of all the communities out there, struggling and dreaming and yearning for change, and he made a silent promise to himself and to them. "We're coming, and we're bringing hope with us." Ethan and Sophia returned to their hometown, riding a wave of newfound influence and attention. Their testimony before Congress had gone viral, sparking a national conversation about housing justice and corporate accountability. Reporters clamored for interviews. Activists sought their advice. Policymakers solicited their input. It was a heady feeling to be suddenly thrust into the spotlight like this. But Ethan and Sophia knew that with this platform came great responsibility. They had a chance now to not only continue their work on a larger scale, but to bring the benefits of that work back to the community that had started it all. They wasted no time getting back to business at Community Defenders. There were still plenty of local issues to tackle, predatory landlords to confront, at-risk neighborhoods to organize, affordable housing initiatives to champion. But they also started thinking bigger, brainstorming ways to leverage their national profile for maximum local impact. One of their first moves was to convene a town hall, inviting residents from all corners of the community to share their housing stories and propose solutions. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people packed into the high school auditorium, representing a diverse cross-section of ages, races, and experiences. There were young families struggling to keep up with rising rents, seniors on fixed incomes facing eviction from long-time homes. There were homeless individuals and shelter residents speaking powerfully about the toll of not having a stable place to live. There were small landlords trying to do right by their tenants and mobile home residents fighting arbitrary fees and poor conditions. As Ethan and Sophia listened to each story, a common theme began to emerge. Again and again, people spoke of feeling powerless in the face of an opaque, unaccountable housing system, of not knowing their rights or where to turn for help, of being one unexpected expense or one bad landlord away from losing everything. It was a sobering realization, but also an energizing one, because in that room, in the collective wisdom and resilience and determination of their community, Ethan and Sophia saw the seeds of real, lasting change. Together with the attendees, they began to map out an ambitious agenda, one that would tackle housing insecurity from every angle. They proposed a Renters' Bill of Rights, enshrining key protections into local law. They sketched out plans for a community land trust to take property out of the speculative market and preserve it for affordable housing. They designed a landlord licensing system to hold property owners accountable for providing safe, dignified living conditions. It was a bold vision, and not everyone was on board at first. Some landlords balked at the idea of more regulation, arguing it would drive up costs and discourage investment. Some homeowners worried that affordable housing would lower their property values or change the character of their neighborhoods. But Ethan and Sophia were undeterred. They knew that real change was never easy, and that it always required bringing people together across lines of difference. So they kept organizing, kept making their case, kept building the coalition. They found unexpected allies in their efforts. A group of faith leaders came together to advocate for the moral imperative of housing justice, hosting events and leading prayer vigils outside slumlord-owned properties. A coalition of labor unions threw their weight behind the agenda, recognizing that their members needed stable, affordable housing to thrive. Even some enlightened developers and business owners came on board, seeing the economic benefits of a more equitable housing market. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The city council, once hesitant to take on the powerful real estate lobby, started to come around as public pressure mounted. One by one, the proposals started becoming law. A cap on annual rent increases, a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction, a requirement for developers to include affordable units in new projects. Each victory was hard fought, and none were perfect. But taken together, they represented a sea change in the way the community approached housing as a fundamental right, a public good, a shared responsibility. And at the center of it all were Ethan and Sophia, The unlikely heroes who had started with a simple mission to save their own homes and ended up sparking a movement that was transforming their hometown and rippling out across the nation. It wasn't easy, balancing their local work with their growing national profile. There were long days and late nights, endless meetings and difficult conversations. There were moments of doubt and frustration, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable and the opposition felt overwhelming. But through it all, they had each other, the unshakable partnership that had sustained them from the very beginning. And they had their community, the countless individuals and organizations who had joined the fight, who were putting in the hard work of change, day in and day out. Together, they were building something remarkable, not just a set of policies or programs, but a new way of living and working and dreaming together. A model of what was possible when people came together across difference, united by a common vision of justice and dignity for all. And as word of their work spread, as other communities started reaching out for advice and support, Ethan and Sophia knew that their hometown was just the beginning, that the fight for housing justice was one that would take them to every corner of the country and beyond. It was a daunting prospect, but also an exhilarating one, because they had seen firsthand the power of organized people to change the world, one block, one neighborhood, one city at a time. And they knew, with every fiber of their being, that a better future was possible, if only we had the courage to imagine it and the determination to build it together. As they stood hand in hand at the groundbreaking ceremony for the community, Land Trust's first project, watching their neighbors wield shovels and crack jokes, Ethan and Sophia felt a sense of pride and possibility that defied description. This was what they had been fighting for all along. Not just a roof over every head, but a sense of belonging, of agency, of hope. A belief that every person, no matter their background or their circumstances, had the right to a place to call home and a say in the decisions that shaped their lives. It was a vision that would guide them through every challenge and every triumph to come. A North Star that would light the way forward, no matter how dark the path. And as they looked out over the sea of faces, the community they had helped to knit together through struggle and solidarity, Ethan and Sophia knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over, but together they would keep marching on. The call came on a sunny spring afternoon as Ethan and Sophia were knee-deep in paperwork at the Community Defender's office. It was the White House on the line, inviting them to a high-level summit on the future of housing in America. The administration had been following their work closely, the staffer explained, and believed their perspective would be invaluable in shaping a bold new national housing agenda. They would have a chance to meet with top policymakers, share their insights with advocates from across the country, and potentially influence legislation that could impact millions of lives. Ethan and Sophia were stunned. It was an incredible opportunity, the culmination of everything they had been working towards. But it also presented a daunting challenge: how to translate their grassroots, community-driven approach to a national scale. How to ensure that the voices and needs of those most impacted by the housing crisis were not lost in the halls of power. They knew they couldn't do it alone. So before accepting the invitation, they called a meeting of their closest allies and advisors, tenant organizers and homeless advocates, housing lawyers and policy experts, faith leaders and labor activists. Together, they grappled with the question of how to maintain their integrity and accountability as they stepped onto a larger stage. The conversation was long and intense, but in the end, a consensus emerged. Ethan and Sophia would go to Washington, but they wouldn't go alone. They would bring a delegation of community leaders with them, individuals who could speak directly to the realities of housing insecurity and the solutions that were working on the ground. And they would use their platform not just to advocate for specific policies, but to amplify the voices and stories of those most impacted. With that decided, they threw themselves into preparation. They held listening sessions and strategy meetings, gathered data and drafted proposals. They coached their delegation members on how to tell their stories and argue their case. And they steeled themselves for the challenges and compromises that lay ahead. When the day of the summit finally arrived, Ethan and Sophia were ready. They marched into the White House with their heads held high, their delegation by their side. Over the course of 2 whirlwind days, they made their case in meeting after meeting for expanded rental assistance and eviction protections, for investments in social housing and community land trusts, for a fundamental shift in how we conceive of and allocate housing resources. It was exhausting work, and not everyone was receptive to their message. There were skeptics who questioned the feasibility of their proposals and opponents who pushed back against the notion of housing as a human right. There were moments of frustration and disappointment when the political realities seemed to dwarf the scale of the crisis. But there were also breakthroughs and victories, moments when they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. A conservative senator who agreed to co-sponsor a bill on eviction reform after hearing the story of a delegation member who had lost everything in a wrongful eviction. A HOA official who committed to piloting a community land trust program after seeing the data on its impact in Ethan and Sophia's hometown. A White House staffer who pulled them aside and confided that their testimony had moved her to tears and strengthened her resolve to fight for change. And through it all, Ethan and Sophia drew strength from each other and from the incredible team they had assembled. They watched in awe as their delegation members spoke truth to power, sharing their stories with poise and passion. They felt the weight of responsibility, but also the joy of solidarity, the sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. As the summit drew to a close, they knew that their work was far from over. The policy proposals they had championed would face an uphill battle in a divided Congress, and the entrenched interests that profited from the status quo would not give up easily. But they also knew that they had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after they had left Washington. On their last night in the Capitol, Ethan and Sophia found themselves walking along the National Mall, the monuments glowing in the moonlight. They talked softly about all they had experienced, all they had learned, about the incredible people they had met from all walks of life, united by a common dream of a place to call home, about the long road ahead and the battles yet to come. And as they stood before the Lincoln Memorial, gazing up at the great man's solemn visage, Ethan felt a sudden rush of emotion. He thought of all the struggles and sacrifices that had brought them to this moment, all the doubts and setbacks they had overcome. He thought of his own family's legacy, the generations who had tilled the soil and weathered the storms, the fight they had waged to hold onto their little piece of earth. And he knew, with a clarity that took his breath away, that this was what he was meant to do. Not just to defend his own home, but to fight for everyone's. To build a world where no one had to live in fear of losing the roof over their head, where every community could thrive and every person could reach their full potential. He turned to Sophia, his partner, his rock, his love. "We're going to do this," he said, his voice trembling with conviction. "We're going to win." Sophia squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with the same fierce determination. "Damn right we are," she said. "Together." And hand in hand, they walked on into the night, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to keep fighting, keep building, keep believing in the power of ordinary people to change the world. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.